Are on camera. Good morning.
Good morning.
It is about 10:30 on Thursday, January 30th, 2020. I'm Sue Verhoff, Director of Oral History and Genealogy here at the Atlanta History Center. Also with me is Taylor Patterson, and Taylor is a member of the Inman Park Neighborhood Association. We are here today to conduct an oral history with Ms. Cathy Bradshaw, who has graciously agreed to be interviewed as part of the Atlanta History Center's partnership with the Inman Park Neighborhood Association. So thank you so much for coming in and doing this, taking the time. So to begin with, could you please share with us a little bit about your background and growing up years in Druid Hills?
We moved to Atlanta in 1958 when I was in the 6th grade. The first year Fernbank Elementary School opened, and my mother was a math teacher at Druid Hills, and so I went to Fernbank and then Druid Hills and graduated in 1965. And we had moved from small towns in Georgia where our dad was a principal, high school principal, and our mother taught everything. She finally settled on math, which had been her major at the University of Georgia. My parents were in graduate school when they met at Georgia. And so we traveled around Georgia for all of my early years and then settled in Atlanta. And my dad was the director of textbooks for the State Department. And my mother taught, and we were not really active in the Druid Hills Civic Association at that time, but after I left home, my mother did get more involved and find out more about what was going on in that neighborhood. And so I knew that neighborhood history and activities were important, and I guess when I moved to Inman Park, that carried through, and I had no choice but to get involved.
Excellent. We're going to take a quick break here. Back on camera. So what I'd like to know is, tell me a little bit about why you chose Brown University and why you chose urban studies as your major. What led you into that?
I was at Salem College in undergraduate, an all-female college, and majored in sociology. And when looking at graduate schools, I thought it would be good, an opportunity to get out of the South. And I applied to Brown and Johns Hopkins. And actually, my Dean of Women told me that I would never get into Brown, and so that gave me the motivation to show her that I could. So I applied and got a full scholarship with the NIH and went to Brown in sociology. They didn't really have a label of urban studies at the time, but that was the specialty I chose. And most of the program was geared more toward statistical analysis. So I got a lot of that, which also ended up helping not in my career but in neighborhood work. So I was at Brown from 69 till 71 and got very involved in the Vietnam War protest movement and became an activist at that point in time. And so Brown was a good breeding ground for my future activities in the neighborhood.
Excellent, excellent. So you, if I understand correctly, you bought your house in Inman Park in 1971 after graduating from Brown.
Correct.
There's some really interesting stories about your parents and how you chose and why you chose. Tell us a little bit about that. Why Inman Park? And
Inman Park was cheap, and when I finished at Brown, I had a hard time finding a job because Nixon had announced the wage and price freeze in the spring of '71. And when I applied for jobs in New York and Boston and eventually in Atlanta, I was told that they weren't hiring anybody with a master's, that they only would hire entry level, and I couldn't come in as a secretary because I didn't have typing skills. And my sister had advised me not to put that I was an excellent typer on my resume because then I would get hired as a secretary. So I couldn't then come back and say, but I can type. So I was forced to abandon my desire to stay in Boston or Providence or go to New York, and ended up back in Atlanta. And good friends from college days were living in Ansley Park. I rented a house in Ansley Park and had roommates. And my house in Ansley was actually for sale for $85,000. But without a permanent job, it was certainly beyond my means to even think about buying a house. But my friends found a house in Inman Park and bought it for $5,000. It had no kitchen, no bathrooms. All the plaster in the walls was damaged. And somehow by working on their house, they convinced me that I should buy a house. And it was very much at the beginning of the movement in Inman Park. And one Sunday afternoon, the house next door to my friends came on the market, and they encouraged me to go look at it. And the slumlord was there showing the house and about how it could be divided from 4 apartments into 5 apartments, and was talking about building a wall down the parquet floor in the dining room. And I just said, no, I'll buy it. You can't let somebody come in and destroy this house even more. And the down payment was $800. I had 4 tenants in the house, and because of this law, you have to give notice, 60 days notice to tenants. The rent was $50 a week, so I got back my down payment in the first 2 months while the tenants were still there. And I assumed a mortgage from the slumlord, and I think it was $82.34 a month. And I was able to afford to buy a house, even though I didn't have a permanent job, and I had used my money that I was going to buy a car with to buy the house. So I had to do a little finagling with my dad after he finally got over the shock of my actually buying a house in a slum neighborhood. And they did not react well to my buying this house. It was truly a slum house that had winos, and it was a weekly rental, and it was in horrible condition. And my parents' reaction, well, I had gone over to tell them the day that I bought the house that I'd bought a house, and Daddy said, using my full name, promise me that you will not rent an apartment in Inman Park while we're out of town. And they were going the next day to visit my sister in Denver, and I said, okay, Daddy, I promise I will not rent an apartment in Inman Park. And I didn't have the courage to tell them that I had actually signed the documents that day to buy a house. And called my sister, and I said, you're going to have to break the news to them. And they were close to disowning me. My dad's statement was, one of his many statements was that we have worked all of our lives to keep you from having to live in a neighborhood like that. And of course, in that time in Atlanta, Inman Park was a slum, and it was not a dangerous neighborhood, but it was a working class, mostly white neighborhood. And the homes, some of the big Victorian homes had been turned into 16 apartments. And so it had declined beyond its days of glory. And at that point in Atlanta, to go south of Ponce de Leon was a dangerous thing in many people's minds. The people who had moved away from Inman Park felt that they had moved to better themselves, and Inman Park was part of the abandoned part of the city that had been left to decay. And so the homes were mostly, I'd say 60% were not owner-occupied, so they were owned by absentee owners, slumlords basically. And the houses were not having any improvements made to them, so the damage that the tenants was doing was becoming more and more. And So I ended up with a house that I had no idea what to do with, and I had no skills. My dad was not a handyman, so I had a part-time job at Sears, and my favorite department to work in was in the paint and hardware department, because I could ask what I thought then was old men. They were probably in their 50s or 60s, and ask them about how to do some of the repairs I needed to do. And the first time I asked a question about how to replace a socket or a light switch, he asked me if I needed a flathead or a Phillips head screwdriver. And I had no idea there was a different kind of screwdriver. And they asked me what kind of, what kind of walls I was putting paint on. And I didn't know anything different between sheetrock and plaster, and I had no idea. So the first paint job I did, I evidently put a water-based paint over enamel, because the next day I went in and the paint was peeling off. And so I had a lot of trial and error opportunities during those early days of owning the house. But stepping back, I should probably tell you about two of the men who were in my apartment that I had my first encounter as a 23-year-old owning a home as a landlord. That this sort of set my history in place. They were named Smokey and Julian, and they were winos and are painted for a living, but drank a lot while they were painting. And Smokey had bitten off his tongue when he was in an automobile accident when he was 16. And Julian was older and kind of looked after Smokey, who couldn't eat regular food. Without a tongue you can't chew very well. And I went to the house the first Friday. The slumlord had told me I had to be there before 5 o'clock on Friday or I wouldn't get the rent, because they would drink it all away. And I showed up, and they were so proud to meet me. And they said, "We've spent all day cleaning our apartment so you could come and see." And I stepped inside, and it smelled like urine, and went into the kitchen, and it was just reeked with odor. It was like there was rotten food in there. And the fellow without the tongue opened the door, and he kind of stuttered, and he was so proud to show me the refrigerator and freezer, and there were roaches all over the food. And everything was mashed potatoes and Jell-O and ice cream and mashed potatoes and gravy, and it was absolutely disgusting. And I was just totally naive and had no idea what I was going to do with these two men who I had to have in my life for 60 days. But they taught me a lot of endurance, and you kind of get through it. But as a departing gift to me, I went up the day they were moving, and they asked me if I liked peach brandy. And I don't know that I'd ever had peach brandy, but I said, well, sure, thinking they were going to give me a bottle of peach brandy. And they opened up the trunk of their car, and there were 2 bushels of rotten peaches in the back of their trunk. And they said, "Oh, you can make some really good peach brandy for yourself." And so, of course, I had to thank them and took them immediately and threw them across the road, in the road right away. And that began my career as a landlord. The other 3 apartments were not as colorful of people, except that the 2 women who lived upstairs was a mother and daughter. And between them, they had 5 children living with them, but they were not the mother of any of the children. Mm-hmm. They had accumulated them in their previous marriages. And I think they had each been married 3 or 4 times, so they had all these children from these other men, none from their own marriages. And the night that I bought the house, I met the women, and they were a little quirky. But I went back the next day. A neighbor called and said, "You've got to come back and see this." And one of the women's car had been burned. And evidently one of the ex-husbands showed up. They had a fight. She threw him out the 2nd-story window, so he burned her car. And so these were the kind of people that were in the neighborhood in Inman Park in 1971. Not dangerous to me at all, but they had their own internal problems and difficulties in life. So I took the house and with the help of my next door neighbors who had been longtime friends, began to get to know other people in the neighborhood. And because we were all struggling to buy our homes and try to find a place to live within them, we started sharing tools and would have Friday night get-togethers and have potlucks. And about that time, I think there were maybe 13, 14, 15 people that were actively thinking about, being involved in a neighborhood. Robert Griggs, who was our leader, and John Sweet were very instrumental in forming the neighborhood organization, which I started getting involved in that first summer. And the organization at that time was named Inman Park Restoration, and that was the name which was used through the years when we began the Inman Park Spring Festival and the tour of homes, and applying for our historic district, gone blank, our National Trust designation. And then at some point, I'm not sure exactly when, but it changed to Inman Park Neighborhood Association because of, I think because of the tax laws and the 501c3, and because we had been involved in political activities that we needed to make certain that we didn't get in trouble with IRS. And so we made a name change. Al Caproni can speak more to that one. But the early days, the first year of Inman Park was just a lot of getting to know the neighbors and finding out who had bought homes, and we all had to rely on each other a lot for lifting and cleaning out. And my future husband bought the house across the street from me, and he knew a little bit about plumbing, and I knew a little bit by that time about patching plaster, and so we got more involved. And his brother lived around the corner, so I knew his brother and his girlfriend and some of the neighbors that lived on Elizabeth Street. And so we just all, had a small community, but a very dynamic community of people who, I think when you're taking on a project like restoring a home, you have to get involved in other things as well. And one of the first things that we did was with Holly Mull, who worked for the city of Atlanta at the time, worked for the mayor. We realized that we needed to change the zoning, and that the neighborhood in the 60s had been rezoned from residential to commercial and industrial. And if we were going to be able to preserve the homes, we needed to have it zoned residential. So we created a survey, or a petition, I guess, for people to sign that they would agree to have their home rezoned from commercial back to residential. And so that was the first political thing I was involved in with the neighborhood. The first fun thing was starting the first spring festival, which was in April of 1972. And I was in charge of refreshments. And since the city hadn't had any spring festivals before, we didn't know what to expect and whether anybody would show up. And we were hoping maybe 300 people would come. And we had a flea market, and people set up a table and sold things. And we had a funky little parade with not very many people. It wasn't a very long parade, but some dressed in Victorian garb. And we had a fellow, my brother-in-law, future brother-in-law, rode a unicycle, and we had a New Orleans band, and it was a very fun but low-key event. And we had a tour of homes, a few of the homes close on Edgewood, and we were expecting about 300, and about 3,000 showed up. And so we were a little overwhelmed, but totally enthusiastic. And I borrowed a van, and another fellow and I went over to Arlen's, where the Home Depot on Ponce de Leon now is, and bought every soda that they had, because what we had gotten from Coca-Cola had run out and no way to resupply that. So we bought all the water, sodas, soft drinks, whatever, and had enough. It was a hot Sunday day, so we needed some refreshments. And the whole purpose of the festival was to try to influence politicians and bankers and insurance companies that we were a stable, growing neighborhood. At that point, we were redlined, and we were not able to get homeowners insurance, and we were not able to get mortgages. And it was even a loan to make repairs was hard to get. And so we had a candlelight tour for the politicians so that they couldn't see all the cracks in the plaster and all, and it was a little bit more appealing with candlelight. And had a box lunch, a box dinner under a tent on Euclid long before we closed off Euclid. This was just a small tent, and invited the leaders of the city to come and see what was happening in Inman Park, and ended up with a party at Robert Griggs and Robert Aiken's home on Euclid. And I assumed that it had some influence. It took me a long time to get a mortgage. After I met Beau, and then we eventually married, we moved from my house to his house, and the back porch of the house was falling off, and we needed a loan to tear off the back of the house, expand, add a larger kitchen, family room. And I went to 13 banks to try to get a loan, and they all said I needed to repair the back porch before they would give us a loan. And the whole point of the loan was to tear the porch off, because it was not safe, and it made no sense to put money into repairing a damaged porch. And so about that time, through that process, John Sweet and others had formed the Bond Community Credit Union, which was all of us pooling our money to create a credit union to make loans available. And it was the first community-based credit union in the country. So it took a while for John to be able to convince the National Credit Union Association that it was a good idea and that it would be a viable enterprise. And it's still thriving today and has grown. And from 1972 to 2020, it's still a valuable asset in the community. And we were able to get a $30,000 loan from them to add on our kitchen and make all the repairs necessary. And then because we had a loan, then we were able to actually get a mortgage a few years later and start making the other repairs. My husband's house, Beau, had bought his house from a woman who had lived in the neighborhood for a long time. So she was one of the elderly women, and she lived in the house with her brother. And they, in World War II, had rented out a room to a woman, so that the house had never really been divided into apartments. But what is now our office was a bedroom, and then what is now our bedroom was a kitchen. So the house had two kitchens, but the Ruth McMillan and her brother and this woman who was their renter shared one bathroom, and the dining room was a bedroom. So the house had been reconfigured, but walls hadn't been removed, and there wasn't a separate entrance added. So it had not been destroyed. So that house was a lot more manageable than my house, which needed a lot of everything plus more. So I sold my house in '78 to Sally Dorn and Bill Ferguson, and I hope you'll interview Sally Dorn at some point. And so we moved into Beau's house, and that's where we live now. And I think he paid $14,000 for his house in 1972 and was moving to Atlanta from Augusta, where he was in the Army. But since his brother was in Inman Park, he moved to Inman Park. And so that was the early days. And I guess Beau came in right before Spring Festival that first year in '72. Yeah.
Well, let me take you back just a little bit. I have a couple questions to ask you about those early days. You mentioned that your tenants, when you first bought the house, had 60 days, correct? To get. Did you get any pushback from any of them? Were any of them upset about having to leave?
No. Weekly renters were, they weren't long-term renters. I don't think the women upstairs had been there but a few months. And no. The man who lived in the downstairs apartment was a traveling mechanic, equipment repair, I'm not sure exactly, but he was often transitory, and I think that was the situation of the neighborhood. No, there was no pushback.
Were the apartments furnished?
No.
Okay. Okay.
I don't think so. They did seem to leave furniture, and I did have a yard sale after they left, and there was enough furniture in it that I made $50, and I used that $50 to buy a crepe myrtle for the front that's still living. And so I don't know whether the furniture was there when they arrived or not. I'm not certain about that.
So 60 days have passed and your renters have left the premises and you move in. What were you thinking that first night in this home? What was that night like?
Through the whole 60 days, what have I done? Why am I doing this? This is a horrible idea. It was not good. I owned a single bed. From graduate school, I had a single bed, a rocking chair, a stereo, and a bookcase. That was it. I was not like I was ready to be a homeowner. It was a very bad idea. No, the only thing good about it was that the mortgage was $82.34. And I had an upstairs roommate, a woman that I had known, and so she was my upstairs tenant. And then I rented the basement apartment to an Emory law student, and I charged him $25 a month, and I felt like I was overcharging him because this place was so awful. The basement had obviously been where a live-in housekeeper had lived, and not in very pleasant circumstances. The bedroom walls were the cheapest plywood you could get. They were paneling. They looked like paneling, but they were abutted. They didn't even have a insulation or anything. I mean, it was horrid construction. And the first night, my tenant came up and he said, "Cathy, there's something happening in the basement that I don't understand, but when I turn on the shower, it sounds like a waterfall." So I got my flashlight and I got my next door neighbor, and we went down and looked under the house, and the shower was held up, attached to the house by two walls, but held up by a 2x4 on the corner, and there was no plumbing. The water was coming in, but there was no drain, so the water was just draining straight to the basement. And it was like that was the first week, and I knew nothing about plumbing. What am I going to do? So it was a series of that kind of events when I first bought this, what felt like a monstrosity. And it was only because there were other people in the neighborhood going through similar things, and there were a few couples who had been there a year maybe. Robert Griggs and Robert Aiken had been there since '70, so they already had a little bit more experience of how to deal with these problems. And I think that house was 14 apartments. Every room was an apartment. So they had a lot of stories. And Charles Helms and Helen Helms lived in a big house that had a lot of apartments. And so by hearing their stories, it gave me a lot more courage to move forward and to tackle stuff. Bonnie and Jeff Dees lived on Edgewood Avenue in a huge house, and they were in the process of renovating. They obviously were not complete, but they agreed to be on tour of homes. And a week before tour, Bonnie had a baby. The newborn baby is in the living room. I mean, these people they can survive anything. I could certainly survive roaches and broken pipes or no pipes. And so I had, was hearing their stories, and I could get courage and encouragement from that.
Okay.
My other big shock was the first winter. I bought the house in June, and the first winter, I had no idea about insulation or, that you should open the valves of your faucet when it freezes. And I came home from work, and my bathroom floor was covered with ice. And of course the downstairs apartment was an ice skating rink. All of the water from my bathroom had flowed down and then frozen, and my tenant had left for school, and he was not at all a tidy tenant. And his clothes were in piles of dirtier, or dirtiest, and it was mainly just Oxford cloth shirts that he wore to law school. But they were in this frozen pile of water. They were frozen. And he was too nervous about the condition of the apartment to leave the heat on during the day, which was probably a good thing because, everything else was so put together so badly. It probably would have burned the place down. But I had all this ice and shirts, and his living room was covered with saltine cracker boxes and peanut butter that tended to be his meals through law school. And it was just rather overwhelming of how do you deal with frozen water, broken pipes, no plumbing, and fortunately our upstairs tenant had a bathroom that we could use. But there were just innumerable experiences like that I kept saying, what have I done? Why am I doing this?
So what made you stay?
$82.34 a month. But by then I had made friends. I mean, it was a great neighborhood. There were, even the people who weren't involved in renovating were fun and interesting people. And there was a lot of variety. There was a lot of diversity. And having majored in sociology, I was interested in diversity. I was interested in different lifestyles. And I also wasn't making a lot of money. So I really was, I guess, stuck, but stuck in a good way because it turned out to be a good thing. I did get a good job, and I did end up having excess money, so we were able to do renovation on the house, and we started buying other properties, and we would go to another neighborhood and buy the worst house on the block and fix it up. By that time, Bo had gotten out of the Army, and he had taken advantage of the GI Bill and taken every course that Atlanta Area Tech offered. And it's part of his story, but he got out of going to Vietnam by going back to school. And in Augusta, the only school available was either medical school, which he wasn't interested in, or technical school, which he wasn't really interested in. But to get out of the Army early, he signed up and took a masonry class. And then when he moved to Atlanta, it was a good way to stay occupied without actually having to have a job. So he took all the courses and ended up with a general contracting license. And so his skills could be put to use in renovating, and I did all the bookwork and paperwork And so we created a company, and after I guess it was when our first child was born in '76, I quit my full-time well-paid job and started renovating houses so I could be at home and working.
And where was the full-time job? Where had you worked?
I had worked in public relations for Georgia Power, and a job I hated. I didn't hate the job, but I didn't want to work for that company, and it didn't meet with any of my beliefs. I think I was one of the few who didn't support Richard Nixon, and I was more interested in alternative energy and trying to do more things creatively, and it didn't really fit my degree, my interests, so I stayed 3 years and moved on.
Tell us a little bit about raising children in Inman Park. What was that experience like?
Since I've never raised children in another neighborhood, I don't have a lot to compare it with. But we had great neighbors, and Jane was the first of the children in our circle of friends, and so she was almost like an experiment. I hate to say that on camera, but we were all learning about how you raise a child, and Jane was an independent, interesting child, and so she had a lot of adult friends, and she went with me where I went. She went to meetings. We didn't have enough money to really hire babysitters, so she had no choice. And she spent time when we were doing construction, and we just hauled her everywhere. And we thought that was what you did. The stabilizing factor was that my parents were still in Druid Hills, and she was with them a lot. And so Bo and I had a lot of freedom because my parents were willing and happy to have Jane part of their life. And I don't think I could have done any of this without the support team that I had of my parents. And I need to swallow. Can I
Sure,
take a break?
absolutely. Off camera, on camera.
And one of the other things that was helpful in the neighborhood, Sally Dorn's name comes up again, was she created a babysitting co-op. And so we had chits of paper and could have a neighbor take care of our child and exchange for the chits no money. And so we got to know other parents in the neighborhood and parents that were had the same age child, and so that strengthened our associations in the neighborhood by having the babysitting co-op. And then the second child came along. It was a little bit more difficult to do the swapping, but by then we had established good friendships with parents, with couples in the neighborhood who had children our children's ages. And because of the spring festivals, the numbers of people in the neighborhood was increasing. And we could see that the numbers were going to grow and that the population was going to continue to change to bring in a much younger group of people and who were interested in, similar activities, not necessarily having children, but of those who did have kids, that we had a lot in common. Culturally, I guess, not necessarily professionally. We had a diverse group of people in terms of their career choices, but all had the common interest of the neighborhood. And so the babysitting co-op was very important. And I think when Jane was 6 weeks old, Bo and I joined a group of neighbors in what we call the Gourmet Club. And the other couples had already started this maybe a year before, so we were new to the group. And so I think it started in 1973 3 or 4, and Jane was born in 76, and that group is still going. And so we still get together once a month and have a dinner together. The host couple prepares the menu and then gives out assignments. And at first it was all international. And so we ran through all of the countries of having international meals once a month. And it meant that because most of us had very awful or meager kitchens at the time, it meant we could prepare one dish, go to somebody's house, and have a full, nice meal without having to go out and pay for a gourmet meal. And we were all very forgiving of each other's homes, and some were putting in kitchens. We started putting in our kitchen in, I think, 79, and so by the time, you know, the club kept going, we had better environment to cook and eat in. But that was a good stabilizing force also, to have friends that we were with every month. And then Bo and I were very fortunate that we lived on, backed up to what we call the Hollow, and it's 3 acres of open land. And when the children started coming, we got to be good friends with the families that lived in the backyard. And it was a safe place to send the kids without having to worry about them being in the street. And you mentioned that Taylor is with us today, and Taylor was one of those children that grew up in the backyard. And so you could always count on kids being in the back and the adults, the parents, to spend time with. And so we all got to be very close, and in some instances have traveled together. And we still get together every year for a Christmas brunch with same families and grown children and now grandchildren. And so the early days of Inman Park really formed a lot of relationships that have endured to now, and also for our children to maintain the friendships of the kids they grew up with.
I'm struck by the fact that both of your children have bought homes in Inman Park. I think that's very unique.
And I have no idea how that happened. I would never have predicted it, because they're both very independent, and I would have assumed that they would have gone somewhere else, but they love the neighborhood as much as we do. And my daughter now has 1 child, and my son has 2 children, and they all went to the Inman Park Cooperative, 10 of them, 2 of them still there. And the co-op, the Inman Park Co-op, is another one of our early activities. That Jane had been in a Mother's Morning program at the Inman Park United Methodist Church, the same church where Bo and I were married, actually. And so 73 we were married at the church, walked to the church to get married. And then in 76 Jane started going to the Mother's Morning Out program. But for various reasons, by 1980 we needed a new facility, a new organization, and some of the well, I guess all of the parents that were involved in the preschool, or the Mother's Morning Out program, started the Inman Park Cooperative Preschool. So it was in the summer of 1981, and we took the basement of an old church, and in about 4 weeks, painted, cleaned, got the rooms organized, and started a preschool. And none of us had ever done anything like that before, but we had a need, and we wanted the structure to be not a babysitting, not a Mother's Morning Out kind of program, but a more educational, more learning opportunity for the kids. And so teachers were hired, structure was set up, all of the parents, being cooperative, all the parents had to work, I was the treasurer, and while Ward was there, I certainly worked more hours in my volunteer job than I did having him in school, which I think that any of the parents who were involved at the preschool in those early days would say was certainly the case, that we worked more in our parent role than our children took advantage of the school hours. But once again, it was a very stabilizing activity, and formed long-time friendships through the preschool.
So
And gave our kids a good start, and I think that was one of the things that was so valuable to my children, was starting at the preschool.
So I'm hearing kind of a recurring theme here, and that is you saw a need and you met it.
Right.
And that seems to be sort of a hallmark of Inman Park.
Right.
I do want to make sure that we talk a little bit about your activism. I'm fascinated by the fact that you were involved in the anti-war movement up at Brown, and thinking about the connections between that and the things that you participated in to protect and preserve Inman Park.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about some of those things.
I think I mentioned the rezoning, and like I said, I didn't ever actually have a job using my degree, but I always found things in the neighborhood that needed to be done that would use things that I had been interested in college and graduate school. The rezoning was one. I guess another early one was during the Inman Park Festival. We needed to spruce up the neighborhood a little bit, so a group of us started cleanups and got the city to finally agree to come and actually haul our building debris away. And as part of that, we tended to like to turn things into fun. They were work, but fun. We had a goal, but we needed to do it in a fun way. So as part of the cleanup, we had a competition to see who could create the most interesting, what do you call them, scenes in front of their homes with their trash. And we were still pulling junk out of the basements, and fans and heaters and rugs, and so we had people would put out a room, basically. They'd roll out the rotten Oriental rug and hang up the what looked like a rusted light fixture, but it was actually brass, and maybe a bed, maybe a sofa, chairs, whatever. Some of them broken, some of them okay. And then we would go around and judge the best room as part of the cleanup. And of course, we all went shopping, and because they were throwing it away, and that's an Oriental rug. We can take that to Sherion's and have it cleaned, and it's better than no rug on the floor at all. And boy, that's a brass light fixture that matches my home. I mean, I need that. That's a bungalow style, and our craftsman style. And so we found treasures in other people's junk, but it also made for a fun way to start Spring Festival. So that was one of the fun things that we did. And in order to entice the city employees to come and clean up on Saturday, we got McDonald's and Burger King, I don't remember who else, to donate food. So we had drinks and refreshments and dessert and stuff, and a band. And so we got the city work crews to come on a Saturday to do the cleanup, and then we had a neighborhood party, and all those guys participated and had a great time. And the end result was that we got the neighborhood cleaned up. And for many years we had the neighborhood cleanup. I don't think we're doing it now, because people we're a lot more clean and tidy, though we have a committee that does it now, but not as wide scale neighborhood activity. My activism, I was on the zoning review board for 2 years for the city, and learned a lot through that process of what the city's approach to rezoning is, and some that I had some influence over and some that none at all. But through that time, I also realized the value of community involvement. And I was on the board of the credit union for a number of years, and on the preschool board, and then served on the neighborhood board as historic preservation vice president, and got the ball rolling and started our designation for the National Trust. And others finished that after I rolled off. And I think I was vice president of I was treasurer for a couple of terms, and then vice president of one more. I can't remember what it was, but somewhere in there. But just to be active on the board and to be active in things that came up, and I think that was a lot of what made the neighborhood so successful, was that when we saw a problem, we did say, okay, we can do something about it. And it is bothersome now when I hear people, or I see on Nextdoor or on chat lines or whatever, is people see a problem, but they want to know who to call and who can fix this. And in my years of being on committees, when somebody would complain about something or tell me that I ought to do something about this, my reaction was, well, great, I'm glad you're willing to volunteer to take that on. And because it's easy for people to expect somebody else to do the work. And I think the adage is true that 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. But Inman Park had a lot higher number of volunteer involvement than that. And from that, we had people who were involved in the politics of the city, getting people elected to office. And because of Ruth Wall, I learned that early on, that if you want to affect change, you have a role in who gets elected. And we, through the years of the road fight, I think we elected 57, 58 people to public office. And our criteria at the time was that they had to be supportive of our issue, which was the road through the abandoned highway land. And so we elected people to city council, county commission in City of Atlanta and DeKalb County, various judges, and a lieutenant governor, and even had impact on who was appointed to the Supreme Court. And so wherever there was an office where positions were taken, we wanted to have a part in that. And also the selection of the member to the Department of Transportation Board, because they had a lot of influence over what happened in our neighborhood. So we were instrumental in getting somebody appointed to that board who could be helpful to us. And then, of course, our state representative, John Lewis, who went from city council to the U.S. House of Representatives. And he has been a constant supporter of Inman Park through the years. And that was a valuable friendship at many points. And so we've, the political involvement was social, because we had wonderful parties and we used it as a time to get together, but it was also important for electing people to office. My first campaign was in 1973, soon after I got to the neighborhood, when the city charter changed from Board of Aldermen to a city council with representative government and a mayor and a strong city council. And so Candler Park had elected Pankey Bradley, and we realized, well, if Candler Park can do it, Inman Park can do it. So we got Charles Helms, who was a local, lived on Euclid Avenue, and he was a Presbyterian minister with impeccable credentials, and we didn't know a lot about skeletons and past of, how much the press would delve into the past, but we knew that Charles didn't have any skeletons in his closet, so he was a good candidate. And I was one of the co-chairs on that campaign to elect him to city council. And we were successful, and we had representation on city council. And then every opportunity that came up after that, we elected John Sweet and Debbie Starnes from Inman Park to represent us. And we don't have a representative from our neighborhood at the moment, but that doesn't mean we won't in the future. And so all those political activities were important, both for the neighborhood and in the road fight, which I got involved in that in 1980. And just as I guess actually it was earlier than that, because I remember pushing Jane in a stroller to one of the events. And so Jane became an activist, I think, because she was involved with parents who were activists and grandparents. My parents were very involved in social justice, and then eventually got involved in the road fight from Druid Hills. And I started taking Jane to rallies and meetings, and then as I got more involved, then she wasn't with me as much at those activities. But for the years before I became president of Caution, I was involved in things like the phone bank, where we had the way to involve people was that if somebody got an announcement about a meeting or a court hearing or an activity, one person would call two, those two would call two, and we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers, we didn't have fax machines, we didn't have any of the modern equipment that would make life so much easier, and certainly no cell phones. We didn't even have telephones that weren't attached to a cord, which is hard to believe that much has changed in my lifetime. But we somehow were able to run the activities of a very diverse organization with a phone tree. And of course some people were professional and had real offices and actually had access to more equipment, and were, being the neighborhood that we were, joined with Candler Park, Druid Hills, Lake Claire, Ponce Islands. We all shared that diverse resource bank of talents and abilities, and never knew that we couldn't take on City Hall. In that instance, we were taking on an ex-governor, Mayor Indy Young, who was a former Jimmy Carter appointee, and all of the press and the business community. And we never knew that we couldn't carry on a fight, because we knew that we were right. We knew that putting in a 12-lane expressway through our neighborhoods was a bad idea. And we knew that the only way to stop it was to become involved. And through the years, I think in the first real rally we had when DOT had a meeting about the environmental impact statement, for people to come and express their opinions and to be recorded and sign up to actually have input. We had over 3,000 people show up. And it's hard for me to think today that we could actually get people to come out for, a small meeting and to show that much passion. But we had, we were fighting for our homes, we were fighting for our neighborhood, and we were able to join with the other neighborhoods. And one of our goals in the early days was, we're not going to betray any of the other neighborhoods. It might have been easy for Druid Hills to say, okay, well, you build the expressway through Inman Park, but don't come to me. But we decided early on that we were going to make this a no road. That was going to be our mantra: keep it simple. We were not going to compromise, and we were going to fight to the end. And it took 10 years, and I haven't added up the number of lawsuits. I've asked for to do that. But we had lawsuits at the city, the county, the Superior Court, State Court, even went to the Supreme Court of Georgia, and the lawsuits were, anytime a lawsuit could be filed, we found a reason to file it, and we would raise the money to make it happen. We had a team of volunteer lawyers that worked diligently. In addition to their own jobs, they worked many hours as volunteers, and we had a lot of volunteers just helping them do research, doing whatever was needed to make it happen. And we had rallies. We had a team of artists and painters and sign makers and costume builders and puppet makers and musicians and public relations, and whatever the need was, somebody could be found to fill the gap of what was needed to for that particular incident. And so when I became president, we were at a point where things were a little discouraging, and we had lost a few battles, but it was just a time to gear up and make the neighborhoods pull together and raise more money and win the battle. And we were fortunate that we had Judge Seeliger in DeKalb County Superior Court, who ruled in our favor on a big decision that DOT could not condemn city parks. And that was sort of the breaking point where we knew that we were finally had some legal backing and some ground that we could build on. And we were able to save the Olmsted Parks on Ponce de Leon. And by that time, the Olmsted linear parks were an important part of the road fight, where national publicity had been gained. And the road could also not go through Candler Park, because the city park had been designated as a park in perpetuity. So DOT could not just condemn the land and build the road through there. So we had reached the point where we saw that success could be ours. We had elected the 57, 58 people to public office. We had a rally at the state capitol, and invited all of the elected officials to come. And Governor Miller was Zell Miller was the governor at that time, and we presented him a proclamation that the time had come to resolve the issue of the highway. And I think that the dynamics of the Olympics coming and the fact that they were not winning as many lawsuits as they had hoped, we had shut down a few other activities that they had tried to pull in the Georgia General Assembly, and the last point was that we had court-ordered mediation from Judge Seeliger between DOT, Caution, and the City of Atlanta. So we entered into 54 hours of mediation and came up with a settlement that DOT, the city, and the neighborhoods could sign off on, and ended up with Freedom Park and Freedom Parkway, which was more like a parkway than the 12-lane expressway that had originally been planned. It was originally a toll road, but became an expressway.
Let me ask you this. You touched on this briefly just a few minutes ago when you commented on the fact that today, people want to know who to call to fix it. You've seen a lot of changes in Inman Park in 49 years.
Right.
How has that changed, or has it? That willingness to see a problem and fix it that we've been talking about?
Well, we still have a great group of people who's interested in doing that, but because we're bigger, and I think that there's, we have a great newsletter. We have community meetings, but with the number of people, it's hard to get information out. And I think people don't know the history. They haven't been involved, and so they don't have the background to know how to get things done. And so it's a fair question to say who can do this, but a lot of those people I don't think would take it on themselves because they don't know that that structure is out there to support them. And I think my biggest issues with how big the neighborhood's gotten is that I don't know everybody. You know, through the years I knew most of the people in the neighborhood, and we had Friday night potlucks on a very informal basis, which has now grown into a porch party, which we have the last Friday of every month. And you know, in those original days, I knew everybody, but as we've grown and have gotten bigger, it's really hard to know I know my immediate neighbors, but it's hard to know the people in the surrounding areas. And as the projects have developed with gates on them, that it's not, you know, they're not as accessible. And so it's important to be involved in things like the festival on a committee and to do things. It's important to go to the neighborhood meetings. It's important to do all those things because that's where you learn and meet people and learn what's going on. And the more, and I've always told people that when they move in and when I meet them, that the more they get involved in the neighborhood, the more they're going to love it. And the more they contribute to the neighborhood, the better the neighborhood will be. And when we get resistance about people not wanting to be on tour of homes or not wanting to volunteer because they have friends coming and they have their own parties to do, it's, well, you know, it takes about 900 people to pull off festival. And if everybody in the neighborhood put in 2 hours, it's not a burden. We have a fabulous committee structure where people know their jobs, they train people. It's a well-run machine at this point. A lot of work involved, but it's still well-run. And the more people volunteer, I think the more fun they have living in the neighborhood, and the better the neighborhood is, because we then have resources and more people to do more things, and we can accomplish more and keep making it better. I think my daughter is now festival co-chair after having, you know, grown up in the neighborhood and gotten involved, and the other co-chair was also born in the neighborhood, Samantha Bailey. And to have these two young women who are co-chairs, and then people like Taylor who are very involved in things in the neighborhood now, that this next generation is coming up, and that's been one of the wonderful things, is seeing that it's not just those of us who've been here a long time, but the new generation, the next generation, and even the grandchildren are getting involved. And one of the funny stories about the grandchildren is that my daughter is very involved and she's an activist. My son, not so much, so his children have not been involved in organizing as much. And one day Jane had some flyers to pass out to invite neighbors to a political party at her home. And so I told the kids, okay kids, come on, we're going to go pass out flyers. And my 4-year-old grandson went to my dining room table, picked up my vase of flowers, and he said, do I get to take these to Zuria? And there's a little girl who lives next door to me. And Jane's son, who was a little over 2 at the time, he went and grabbed the flyers. He knew the difference between flyers and flowers. So the kids are getting involved, but in their own way.
If you had to choose sort of an overarching singular accomplishment that you have done in all of your associations with Inman Park, what would kind of be the standout?
Seeing the road fight through mediation, and going to more meetings than I could possibly count. But the reward was there, that in the end we prevailed, And I think it has had a long-lasting impact on the neighborhood that the effort was worth it. And I think my children probably suffered a lot through that time, and they didn't have as much attention as I could have devoted to them. But for me, it developed a lifelong friendship with people, not just in Inman Park, but Candler Park, Lake Claire, from Druid Hills. And it was, yeah, I think that was the biggest, that I gained as much from it as I gave back to the neighborhood.
Well, I would argue that your example that you have set for your children is priceless, and they can't get that any other way. So I'm
to learn the difference between flyers
so
and flowers.
No, I love that. Just take a quick look here. I think that we have covered most.
I didn't give the background of how I got into the road fight and what all that meant. I kind of assumed that people knew what the road fight was.
Well, tell us about it.
Maybe I should just clarify that a little bit. I realized I jumped to mediation. But in the 1960s, the Georgia Department of Transportation had planned on building an expressway from Atlanta to Athens called the Stone Mountain Freeway. And when I was growing up in Druid Hills, my junior year in high school, my parents received a letter from DOT that there would be this road going down Ponce de Leon, and that their house would be affected in that a 12-foot high chain link fence would be outside our bedroom windows, and that the first two houses on the street would be torn down to make room for an access road on the south side of the freeway. And at that point in time, I think it was 1964, my parents had no idea that you could fight DOT. And so they didn't do anything about it, as far as I know. I went off to college and came back, and Jimmy Carter had been elected president, and after his term was up, he came back to Atlanta, and the road that had been designated for the freeway was now abandoned. Ironically, Carter was the one who stopped the freeway in, I think, 72 maybe, when he was governor. And it was before then. When he was governor, a Blue Ribbon Commission had recommended against the freeway and all that. But when he came back after serving as president, he needed a place to put his library. And the way the laws were written, that any land that had been cleared with federal funds could be used for another use, but there had to be a designated highway as part of the project. So Carter could get the land where an interchange had been previously planned for the connection of I-485, which was the north-south road going through Morningside, Virginia Highlands, and on up to 400 in North Atlanta, and then the Stone Mountain Freeway. So there was a big interchange planned where the Carter Center now is. It was a big cloverleaf. And as long as he had a road component, he could put his library and the Carter Center on that land and pay a small sum for the Carter Center part of it. And so that was the reason that the Presidential Parkway was created. Andy Young was president. He was happy to do something to make President Carter happy. And Andy Young and his entourage came to Inman Park to present the plan. And he was astounded that we weren't just overwhelmed and thrilled because they were going to put in tot lots right next to this parkway. And we're going, you're going to put a playground right next to where kids are going to be playing? I mean, cars are speeding by, and at that time it was a full-blown expressway with high speed and tractor trailers and 5 bridges over city streets, and to us it looked just like the expressway it was, and that's why we called it the Ex-Pres Way, and after President Carter. And we were I naively was under the assumption in the early days that President Carter, who was out working for peace and justice and, preaching basically peace and collaboration and work with your neighbors, and we can have world peace, but I just naively thought that he at some point would come and work with his neighbors, and yet he shunned us and never made an effort to make peace with us, even though we thought we had valid grounds and that we weren't fighting the library. The library could exist, but we wanted the road to be scaled down and only to go around the library and not to impact the neighborhoods. And it was really astounding to us that he would not willingly or actively participate in trying to resolve things. And so we ended up in a full-blown battle, so to speak. And it became personal at that point that he seemed to be putting something in that was going to be detrimental to the community. And I got in, as I said earlier, I did get involved just in rallies and committee work, and somehow because of my background I ended up getting pulled into it more and more. And I think all of it went back to that letter that my dad got in '64 that it was going to be so destructive, and I could see, a lot of people didn't understand what, build a road, it's just a road. But when it's going to be right next to your bedroom, I think my understanding of it was a little bit better, and also because of my not training, but education. I think I understood it a little bit more and was willing to participate. And because we had such a good team of lawyers and other activists, that it was an easy role for me to slip into.
Always kind of makes me think of It's a Wonderful Life, the building and loan in the town, and the community-based, and
Well, we've got a great neighborhood.
You do.
A lot of people want to live in our neighborhood, and I think that's a tribute to all of us who've worked hard to make it a good place to live.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Is there anything we haven't covered that feels important to you?
Probably the other thing is our trees.
Yes.
And early on, the trees of Inman Park it was obvious that they were aging, and I did participate on the tree watch and the tree committee, and that has evolved into a great group of people working with Trees Atlanta, which was in its formative years and also getting started. So we were able to team up with Trees Atlanta early on, but in the early days we just had neighbors go out and prune and clean up the trees. And one of the incidents that I was specifically involved in was that where the Little Five Points Community Center now is, was an elementary school, and there was a live oak in the yard of the school that was absolutely fabulous and had a big drooping branch that touched the ground. And Cumberland Island has been a part of my passion through the years, and we spent a week or two at Cumberland every summer, and so I loved the live oaks. And the city Atlanta Public School crew came in one day and cut the tree down, and it was probably a 100-year-old tree, and the branches that were the one that was drooping to the ground was probably 24 inches in diameter. I mean, it was just an absolute wonderful, but it had a perfect little sway in it for kids to sit and hang out at school. And they cut the tree down because they said it was unsafe for the kids. That tree was not unsafe for the kids, and it just infuriated me. So I went to Greens, and I can't remember the other. There was another large landscape company in Atlanta, and I called and many different companies that sold trees, and finally found one that had bought 2 live oak trees for a client that didn't want them. And so I bought the live oak. It was probably 12 feet tall maybe, and we planted it near where the destroyed tree had been. And it's still growing. It's getting big. It doesn't have any big drooping branches yet, but I am a bit proud of that tree, that we were able to replace it, and I think that gave me motivation to get more involved with the tree work in Inman Park. That happened before Jane started school, so it must have been 74, 75. So that tree has been growing since 1974, and it just shows that trees do. They will get big in your lifetime. Some people are afraid to plant trees. Like Taylor's parents planted a white oak, and they were advised not to because it would be so slow growing. And that tree is just fabulous now. It is just wonderful. My next door neighbor also planted a white oak, and well, we planted one in her memory, her honor. And that tree is huge. And so they may be slow growing, but I'd hate to see how big it would be if it were a fast growing tree, because the one in your yard is just fabulous. So the trees are very important to Inman Park.
And I noticed a few years ago you were honored with a tree planting ceremony at Inman Park. So
yes.
I think those efforts have certainly been
For
recognized.
my 70th birthday, and they planted 70 trees. So
that's wonderful.
So that was good. Yeah,
that's wonderful. Taylor, can you think of anything that you'd like to ask?
I just wanted to, with your educational background in urban planning, what has it been like to see the commercial development on North Highland, that Inman Quarter sort of district? Did you ever sort of envision that happening, or?
No, not. We didn't have. I didn't have the anticipation that there would be ever the kind of money or draw to Inman Park. So no. I of course looked at the old industrial yard more from the point of renovating it and doing a creative adaptive reuse. Like Bo and I bought the building that the Highland Bakery is in, and have turned it into, well, originally to artist studios, and to put a bakery back in it, which the building had originally been built for in the 30s. And so I'm more interested in adaptive reuse. And so the new structures are a stretch for me. I do understand and I appreciate the fact that in order to have the wonderful restaurants and shops that we have, you have to have density. So I've never opposed the density, but I have, my design would have been different. And I do have problems now with our city planning department. We've never really had much planning from the city. We used to have a wonderful planning staff on the city, but through the years it seems that developers have more influence over what the planning is, and we have a current situation where using a two-way street, putting in 2 new buildings with a lot of employees and visitors, and no plans for rapid transit, no bus stop, no pullover for Uber or deliveries, no handicap parking. And so I have from my planning perspective, I have real issues with that, but that has not prevailed with the city. So, we will always be having battles, and some we lose, some we win, and we just keep persevering. But it has changed the dynamic of the neighborhood. But most of it is good. Some of it I'm not so happy about, but I think that's part of the dynamic of a growing city. The Beltline is wonderful, and that's been great. But that again never anticipated the amount of influence it would have over development, and that the focus has been on much larger development with not many controls that I think has been to its detriment. And I would like to have seen more diverse housing put along the Beltline, and maybe that will come in the future.
Well, this has just been a delight and a pleasure. I can't tell you how much I've learned. I'm so impressed with all that you've done. I think to a large degree Inman Park owes its survival to your efforts. Inman Park wouldn't be Inman Park had it not been for the successes that you had with Caution and with the activism that you have promoted and sponsored and fostered.
Well, and you have to remember that this was a group of people.
Of course.
And I was one of a group. And you know, I've seen some obituaries written by people who were involved in the road fight, and they say that they won, you know, saved. And I go, whoa! There were 3,000 of us. You know, there were 4,000 of us. There were a lot of us out there. And I stress that it was only because of the diversity of the in-town neighborhoods and the willingness of a lot of people. And I just latched on and rolled with it. But there are many, many names that come up that need recognition during all of Inman Park's history. And I think that's important to remember, that it took a group.
Absolutely, absolutely. But thank you for all of your efforts to organize, and the unique personality that you have that has drawn people to the effort.
Well, thank you. It's
Thank
been fun. Like I said, we like to turn things into fun as well as work. So
Awesome.
That's always important.
Well, thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate
Thanks.
it. Thanks. Oh, Cathy.